If you're watching this right now, you're about to discover how one Allied scout turned a seemingly reckless idea into a weapon that saved lives and exposed enemy positions faster than any conventional method of the time. Before we dive into this remarkable story of tactical ingenuity born from desperation, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this, grounded in real history and the incredible resilience of ordinary soldiers, drop every week on this channel, and you won't want to miss a single one. The night of June 14th, 1944, was the kind of darkness that swallows sound itself. Normandy's bocage, that dense network of hedgerows, sunken roads and ancient earthworks, had become a maze of death in the weeks following D-Day. Private James Caldwell of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry Regiment, lay prone in the mud beside a collapsed stone wall, his breath coming in controlled, measured streams. His eyes had adapted to the gloom over the past hour. The pupils dilated so fully they resembled dark pools in his weathered face. Around him, the landscape was a composition of greys and blacks, shapes without definition, a world rendered almost abstract by the absence of light. Caldwell was a scout, not the romanticized kind celebrated in magazines back home, but the real article, a man trained to move unseen, to gather intelligence, to return alive with information that kept other soldiers from walking into ambushes. He had volunteered for this role not out of patriotic fervor, though he possessed that in measure, but because he was good at it. He possessed the particular faculty of patience, an ability to remain motionless for hours while his mind stayed sharp and his senses fanned outward like a web. He could read terrain the way a scholar read books, understanding its grammar of elevation and concealment. But tonight something was different. Over the past week his platoon had lost 3 men to sniper fire, not in dramatic confrontations, but in those moments of seeming safety. A man lighting a cigarette 50 yards from the German line, another adjusting his pack in a farmyard, a third simply looking out from a hedgerow to survey a road. The shots had come from nowhere apparent. The Waffen-SS had positioned snipers throughout the bocage, men trained in a systematic doctrine that emphasized patience, positional discipline, and an almost monastic dedication to camouflage and concealment. These were not ordinary riflemen. They were specialists, equipped with Karabiner 98 Kurz rifles, fitted with ZF-39 or ZF-42 scope magnifications that turned human figures into art projects requiring a single, deliberate brushstroke. The SS sniper doctrine was methodical and brutal. Each trained marksman, and there were enough of them scattered through the Norman countryside to constitute a genuine threat, operated according to principles refined through years of experimentation. They would select firing positions based on a complex calculus, fields of fire, escape routes, wind drift patterns, light angles, distance to water sources for settling dust. They understood that a sniper's primary advantage was not superior marksmanship, though that mattered, but superior patience and superior positioning. The best sniper was the one nobody had yet located. A dead sniper, by definition, had failed in their primary mission. Counter-sniper work, by contrast, was agonizingly slow. The conventional method employed by the Allies with grinding persistence involved systematic search patterns. You would identify the likely origin point of fire based on bullet trajectory, wind direction, and point of impact. Then you would search methodically, expanding outward in concentric arcs, using binoculars and spotting scopes in daylight when visibility permitted. You would establish counter-sniper positions yourself and wait, hoping the enemy would fire and reveal their location. But snipers, especially trained ones, rarely obliged. They would shift positions, sometimes leaving an area entirely rather than risk exposure. The average time to locate an active sniper under normal conditions ranged from 4 to 6 hours. In darkness, it could stretch to entire nights of fruitless searching. Caldwell had been part of 3 counter-sniper operations since D-Day. Each had consumed time and ammunition and nerves in roughly equal measure, and only one had resulted in the locating and neutralizing of a target. The frustration was not merely tactical, it was visceral. Men under your command were dying to an invisible enemy, and conventional methods felt like searching for a ghost in a fog. It was this desperation, paradoxically, that had planted the seed of Caldwell's unconventional idea. 3 days prior, during a daylight reconnaissance of a destroyed village, Caldwell had been moving through the rubble of what had once been a schoolhouse. The stone walls had been partially collapsed by artillery, leaving jagged openings that served as excellent vantage points. He was searching for signs of German activity, disturbed ground, discarded equipment, shell casings, when he noticed something that would ordinarily have gone unnoticed. A beam of sunlight, angled through one of the window openings, had caught the lens of a discarded pair of field glasses. The flash had been instantaneous, but brilliant, a tiny star of reflected light that would have been invisible from directly ahead, but was unmistakable from an oblique angle. That observation had triggered a memory from his pre-deployment training. An instructor, a sergeant with combat experience in North Africa, had once made an offhand remark about snipers and optics. Any scope, any lens, any piece of polished metal will reflect light if you catch it from the right angle, the sergeant had said. A sniper's worst enemy isn't always enemy fire. It's his own equipment giving him away. That glint of a scope in the sun has cost more snipers than any counter-sniper team. The lesson had been presented as a warning about concealment discipline, not as a tactical opportunity. But Caldwell's mind, honed by months of close calls and near misses, had begun to extrapolate. If snipers' optics were vulnerable to light reflection in daylight, what about at night? What if you could create a controlled reflection at night, a flash that would catch the lens of a sniper's scope and, more importantly, would provoke a response? The theory was elegant but dangerous. A sniper's training emphasizes one paramount rule: fire only when you have a high-probability target. Never fire at suspected positions. Never waste ammunition on shadows or sounds. Every shot is a confession of location, but a human being, even a thoroughly trained one, reacts to threat. And a sudden, unexpected flash of light at night, particularly if it could be made to appear as if it were the muzzle flash of hostile fire, or worse, the signal light of an enemy position, might trigger an involuntary response. Not always, but often enough. The tool for this experiment was the TL-122, a British-issue flashlight that Caldwell had acquired through the nebulous economy of army supply. It was a compact unit, powered by an ever-dwindling supply of batteries, with an adjustable beam that could be narrowed to a tight cone or widened to illuminate a broader area. In Caldwell's calculation, the key was not to illuminate broadly, but to create a brief, controlled flash. A micropulse of light that would be visible but not so sustained as to present an obvious target. His first test had come by accident, not by design. While moving through a forest 2 miles behind German lines, conducting a routine patrol, Caldwell had been momentarily startled by a noise, later identified as a deer, though his nerves had classified it as something far more sinister in those first fractional seconds. His hand, gripping the flashlight in a tense fist, had inadvertently activated it for perhaps a quarter second. The beam, angled downward and forward, had caught the wet leaves of the forest floor and scattered back as a diffuse, ghostly glow. From approximately 200 meters away through the trees, Caldwell had heard it, the unmistakable sharp report of a rifle shot. The round had passed somewhere above his position, audible as a crack rather than a whistle, which meant it had been fired at a steep angle. He had immediately dropped flat, his heart hammering against his ribs, and had remained absolutely still for the next 20 minutes. No follow-up shot came. When he eventually extracted himself from the position and moved to the location from which the shot had originated, he found nothing but a disturbed patch of ground and evidence of rapid withdrawal. That night, lying in the battalion aid post while a medic examined his ears to make certain the psychological terror had not ruptured his eardrums, Caldwell had understood something crucial. The flash had been visible. The sniper had reacted to it. And more significantly, The sniper had fired, which meant the sniper had located and revealed his position through that very act. The lesson was profound but counterintuitive. A sniper's greatest strength, the ability to remain hidden, became a liability once that position was betrayed. The problem was simple: how to create a flash that was visible and provoked a response, yet did not immediately give away your own position. The answer, Caldwell came to understand, through a series of deliberate experiments over the following days, lay in optics and angles and the peculiar physics of how light behaves in darkness. A flashlight beam, directed straight ahead at a sniper's position, would indeed be visible, but the return light vector would point directly back to the source, making Caldwell himself an easy target. But a beam angled obliquely, scattered off a surface at an angle that would carry it toward an enemy position but not directly back to the source, would present a different problem for the sniper. The sniper would perceive the light as incoming fire, a muzzle flash at a calculated distance, and would respond accordingly, but the angle of that response would be subtly off, bleeding away from the source of the flash, rather than toward it. This was where the physics became crucial. When light strikes a curved surface, like the front lens of a rifle scope, it reflects not as a perfect mirror image, but as a scattered bloom, a diffusion that creates a momentary highlight visible from multiple angles. The human eye, in conditions of darkness where the pupils are fully dilated in what scientists call the scotopic or rod-driven vision state, is exquisitely sensitive to even minute light sources. The sniper's eye, peering through a scope in darkness, would register that scattered reflection as unmistakably artificial, unmistakably hostile. Moreover, and this was the element that transformed the tactic from an interesting experiment into something that might actually save lives, the startled response is involuntary. Even the most disciplined soldier, even a man trained to remain motionless for 16 hours at a stretch, experiences a physiological response to unexpected stimuli. The sympathetic nervous system activates, the trigger finger tightens, and in that microsecond between perception and conscious discipline, a shot might be fired. Now, on this particular night, Caldwell was about to test his theory under actual combat conditions, with live stakes and no margin for error. He was accompanied by Private Marcus Holbrook, a spotter who had attached himself to Caldwell's operations over the past week after the death of his previous partner. Holbrook was from Texas, a drawl that seemed incongruous with the tight, focused expression he wore perpetually. He had brought with him something valuable, a periscopic sight, a German device captured during a previous engagement that allowed observation over obstacles without exposure. The two of them had positioned themselves in a sunken road approximately 500 meters from the village, where, based on patrol reports and the pattern of sniper kills, German positions were likely established. The intelligence picture pieced together from company headquarters suggested that the SS had established a sniper line in the village's upper stories. The church bell tower was an obvious choice, though the church itself had been partially destroyed, making that option less tenable. The converted schoolhouse remained intact, however, and its upper floor windows commanded 3 separate fields suitable for ambush positions. German doctrine was to establish these positions well before they were needed, stocking ammunition and water, preparing hasty escape routes through basement walls or across rooftops where possible. The sniper would fire only when he had a high-probability target, then reposition immediately. The entire operation might be conducted in near silence, with the sniper's presence unknown until bodies began accumulating. Caldwell had chosen this night specifically because of the weather conditions. The evening had been overcast, but the clouds were breaking apart as a cool front pushed through, and a partial moon would soon be visible. The ground was muddy from the previous day's rain, perfect for visual reflection, as water surfaces, even in microscopic quantities clinging to grasses and soil, reflect light differently than dry earth. Humidity was high, which meant the air itself would scatter light in subtle ways, creating a diffusion pattern that might mask the light's origin slightly while amplifying its visibility to an observer looking in the general direction of its source. "You're sure about this?" Holbrook whispered, his Texas drawl somehow still evident even in a voice barely above audible. His fingers were wrapped around the periscope sight, his eye pressed against the rubber cup that served as eyepiece. "No," Caldwell replied, also at a whisper. "But I'm certain that what we're doing right now, lying in this ditch waiting for something to happen, isn't working." "Fair enough," Holbrook acknowledged. He adjusted the periscope slightly. "I have sight lines on 3 of the upper windows. At least 2 of them have that particular darkness behind them that suggests an interior position with good sight lines. I'd wager that's where they are." Caldwell nodded, though the gesture was wasted in the darkness. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight. They had agreed on a sequence of signals, a series of micro-flashes, no more than a quarter-second each, spaced 2 seconds apart, angled toward the first suspected position. The pattern would look somewhat like irregular firing, not the precise, carefully spaced pattern of disciplined military communication, but the chaotic staccato of sudden combat. An observer, particularly one primed by stress and darkness to expect enemy activity, might interpret it as muzzle flashes from an attempted ambush. Caldwell's breath was steady, but his awareness had contracted into a narrow tunnel. He was conscious of the weight of the flashlight in his hand, the coolness of the mud against his prone body, the particular quality of the darkness around them. Somewhere out there, perhaps in one of those windows, a man waited in similar darkness, his eye pressed against the scope of a rifle, his trigger finger resting gently against cold metal. That man had killed 3 soldiers in this battalion. He had done so efficiently and without remorse, because that was his function, his role in the vast machinery of war. Caldwell was about to upset that man's night. He depressed the flashlight button for a quarter second. The beam lanced out, angled upward at approximately 30 degrees, narrowed to a tight cone that illuminated a section of the schoolhouse's upper wall. The light was visible for perhaps 200 meters, enough to register as something other than natural phosphorescence or imagination. Then darkness reclaimed the space. 2 seconds of silence. Caldwell was conscious of his heartbeat, of Holbrook's breathing, of the particular quality of anticipation that precedes action. He flashed again. This time the beam angled slightly differently, a subtle shift that made it appear as if the source was moving, as if multiple positions were engaging simultaneously. Darkness again. 2 more seconds. Somewhere in Caldwell's consciousness, he was aware that he might be making a fatal mistake. Snipers were, by definition, disciplined. They understood the difference between real threats and provocations. The pattern of flashing might be immediately recognized as what it was, a tactic, a trap, an invitation to respond. The third flash came, angled toward a different window. For a moment, perhaps 3 full seconds, nothing occurred. The silence seemed to deepen, to acquire weight. Caldwell had the disorienting sense that time itself had paused, that the universe was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Then the night split open. The sound of the rifle shot was immense in the darkness, a concussive crack that seemed to reverberate from the very fabric of the air. The round passed somewhere above their position, audible as a distinctive supersonic snap, a sound that told an experienced ear that the trajectory was steep. The sniper, having perceived the flashes, had fired upward at an angle, attempting to strike at what he calculated to be a position above the level of the ground. There! Holbrook was already rotating the periscope sight toward the window from which the shot had originated. Upper left, second window from the corner. I saw the muzzle flash. Caldwell was moving before the acoustic information had fully processed in his brain. The position of the sniper had been betrayed by his own response to the provocation. The man had perceived what he believed to be hostile fire and had reacted according to his training, seeking elevation and presuming that an attacker firing from the ground would be attempting to strike at a position higher than his own. It was a reasonable calculation, but it was based on incomplete information. It was, precisely as Caldwell had hypothesized, the momentary triumph of involuntary response over calculated discipline. The counterfire came swiftly. Caldwell had positioned men in 3 separate locations along the hedgerow behind them, men equipped with rifles and, more importantly, with a marked, fixed position on the identified enemy location. The sniper's flash, brief as it was, had given them a precise target. 3 rifles engaged simultaneously, their rounds going through the window opening and into the room beyond. The fire was not aimed with sniper precision, but was calculated to suppress, to force movement, to prevent the enemy from establishing a follow-up shot. The sniper did exactly what he was trained to do under fire. He moved. His position was compromised. The tactical situation had become untenable. Caldwell and Holbrook, moving rapidly through the darkness and relying on pre-planned routes through the hedgerows, followed the sniper's retreat through several changes of position over the next 30 minutes. Each time the man fired, attempting to shake pursuit and establish a new firing position, he revealed his location to counter-fire teams positioned in a rough net through the village. By dawn, the sniper had been forced to evacuate entirely, abandoning his position and moving to a secondary line. But the test had been conclusive. The method worked. Over the following weeks, as Caldwell refined and systematized the tactic, the operational implications became clear. The time to locate a sniper using the flash provocation method averaged approximately 45 minutes to 1 hour, a dramatic reduction from the 4 to 6 hour conventional search time. More significantly, the sniper was forced to take action, to abandon passive defense and become an active participant in his own location. The very discipline that made him effective, the patience, the willingness to remain motionless, became a weakness when that position was compromised. Word of Caldwell's method spread slowly through the battalion, then through the brigade. It was not officially recognized in tactical doctrine. Such innovations rarely were in 1944. But in the informal, almost whispered channels through which soldiers communicate, the knowledge permeated. Other scouts began experimenting with similar techniques, though few possessed Caldwell's particular combination of intuition and physical discipline. The method required a peculiar mental calibration. You had to understand not just the physics of light, but the psychology of fear, the way a trained mind responded when that training encountered the unexpected. What emerged was something approaching a minor tactical revolution, though no one would have described it in such grandiose terms. It was simply a more effective way of solving a particular problem. The SS snipers, adjusting to the new threat, began implementing new countermeasures. They adopted stronger discipline regarding response to suspected provocation, understanding after several losses that involuntary response was a liability. Some began using decoy positions, firing from locations other than those they occupied to further confuse counterfire. The tactical calculus shifted, as it always does when both sides possess sufficient intelligence and adaptability. The night of July 3, 1944, marked the climax of Caldwell's most significant engagement using the technique, and it was also the night that would have ripple effects extending well beyond his battalion. A full rifle company had been pinned by sniper fire in an orchard approximately 1,000 meters south of the village of Saint-Germain-du-Père. The company commander, Captain Robert Morrison, had attempted to break out 3 times and had been forced back each time. The sniper was operating from somewhere in the farmhouse complex on the northern edge of the orchard, a converted manor house with thick stone walls and multiple exit points. The sniper's discipline was exceptional. He had fired only twice, but both shots had found targets. The first had wounded a lieutenant, the second had killed a sergeant, and more importantly, from the sniper's perspective, both shots had accomplished the tactical objective. They had forced the company into a defensive posture and prevented any effective counterattack. Caldwell had been attached to battalion headquarters by that point, ostensibly as a scout, but increasingly in the role of informal advisor on counter-sniper operations. Captain Morrison had specifically requested his assistance. They had met briefly, Morrison explaining the situation with the clipped efficiency of a professional soldier and finishing with a direct statement. "I need the sniper located and neutralized within the next 2 hours. If we're pinned here after dark, German reserves will move in and we'll have a significantly larger problem." This was the moment when Caldwell's method needed to prove not merely effective, but decisive. The conventional solution would have been to call for artillery support or air support, but the weather was uncertain and such support was far from guaranteed. The practical solution was to force the sniper to reveal himself through provocation, locate him with precision, and suppress him with effective fire. Caldwell positioned himself in a ruined cottage approximately 400 meters from the farmhouse. He had a clear line of sight to the windows on the building's southern face, and the terrain provided sufficient cover that his flash emissions would be difficult to triangulate. Holbrook, who had remained attached to him as spotter, was positioned 200 meters to the east in a location that would provide an enfilading angle on any position the sniper might occupy in the farmhouse. The evening light was fading rapidly, the sky transitioning from blue to purple to grey with that peculiar accelerating quality of summer twilight. Caldwell's eyes, even partially adapted to the gathering darkness, could still make out details of the farmhouse, the window openings, the chimneys, the slight slope of the roof. He was conscious of his breathing, of the weight of the flashlight in his hand, of the particular intensity of focus that came with high stakes. He activated the flashlight, directing the beam toward the upper left window of the farmhouse. The flash was brief, a micro-pulse that illuminated a section of stone wall for perhaps 1/10 of a second. Darkness reclaimed the space. Nothing happened. Caldwell waited 30 seconds, allowing the sniper time to process the flash if he had perceived it. Some snipers operated on the principle of never firing at uncertain targets. Others believed that the best response to enemy fire was no response at all. Allow the enemy to waste ammunition, wait for a high-probability target, conserve rounds. The second flash came at a different angle, directed at the central window. This time, Caldwell held the beam slightly longer, perhaps a quarter second. The light was visible as a brief, diffuse glow across the stonework. Still no response. Caldwell felt a twinge of uncertainty. It was possible the sniper had already withdrawn. It was possible the sniper had recognized the pattern for what it was and was disciplining himself to ignore it. It was possible, and this possibility weighed on Caldwell's mind with particular heaviness, that Caldwell had misunderstood the tactical situation entirely, that his method was not as effective against a truly experienced and highly trained operator as against ordinary riflemen. The third flash came in rapid succession with the fourth, a doubled pulse directed upward at the roofline. Caldwell was conscious of a slight acceleration in his heartbeat, a sense of pushing deeper into territory he did not fully understand. This time, the response was immediate and violent. The window seemed to explode outward as a rifle shot cracked through the evening air. The round passed somewhere above Caldwell's position, the supersonic snap of its passage audible as a hostile whisper. A second shot followed almost immediately, this one angled slightly differently, the sniper attempting to adjust for what he perceived to be Caldwell's location. "He's there! Upper center window, muzzle flash visible." Holbrook's voice came through the small radio, the transmission crisp and clear, despite the ambient noise of incoming fire. The signal had become the provocation. The provocation had revealed the position. Caldwell was already moving, repositioning to a secondary location they had pre-planned. Holbrook engaged simultaneously, his rifle barking with that particular sharp bark of military ammunition. From the orchard to the south, 3 other marksman positions opened fire, their rounds converging on the farmhouse window. The sniper attempted to fire again, but the volume of counterfire was overwhelming. A round struck the window frame, fragmenting brick and mortar. Another punctured through the glass and wall in a neat trajectory that suggested a grazing hit, the kind that might wound but not kill. The sniper moved. Caldwell tracked the movement through the farmhouse's interior, watching as shadows shifted in the darkness of one window and then appeared in the adjacent opening. The man was evacuating, relinquishing the position and moving toward the rear of the building where presumably he had established an exit route. It was precisely the moment of vulnerability that Caldwell had anticipated. The final engagement lasted perhaps 90 seconds. By the time darkness had fully settled, the sniper's position was abandoned, and a reconnaissance team moving through the farmhouse found evidence of hasty withdrawal. A discarded water bottle, a few rounds of ammunition scattered on the floor, a blood smear on the window frame where a round had apparently grazed flesh. The sniper himself had escaped through a basement exit that led to the hedgerows beyond, but his position had been neutralized and the company commander's problem had been solved. The company moved out of the orchard without additional casualties, linking up with a supporting unit for the push northward. Caldwell never learned the identity of that particular sniper. He was informed later that a German soldier had been taken prisoner approximately 5 kilometers away, a man with a graze wound on his arm and a ZF-39 scope rifle, but Caldwell never confirmed whether this was the same sniper from the farmhouse, nor did it particularly matter. The tactical point had been proven. The method worked consistently. It provided an advantage that was genuine and replicable, and it had saved lives by reducing the time needed to detect and neutralize a persistent threat. What followed over the next 6 weeks of operations was a grinding campaign through the Norman Bocage and then into Brittany. The tactic was employed perhaps a dozen more times with varying degrees of success. Some sniper positions were neutralized efficiently. Others were abandoned before counterfire could be concentrated. Still others proved to be positions of secondary importance, decoys designed to distract from actual firing locations elsewhere. The game between hunter and hunted became progressively more sophisticated, both sides learning from each engagement, adapting tactics and countermeasures in that endless evolution of military doctrine. By late August, with the breakout from Normandy well underway and German forces in the region effectively defeated as a cohesive operational force, the sniper threat had diminished considerably. Caldwell was eventually rotated to the rear for a brief period of rest and recuperation, during which time he was interviewed by a major from Division Intelligence who was documenting lessons learned from operations. The major had been particularly interested in the physics of the flash provocation tactic and had asked Caldwell to explain the principles repeatedly, as if trying to understand not just the operational method, but the underlying thought process that had generated it. "It seems almost foolish," the major had said, "to deliberately draw fire by creating a light source. Every instinct in warfare suggests the opposite. Minimize your signature, reduce your visibility, make yourself a small and insignificant target." "Yes, sir," Caldwell had replied, "but the sniper's signature isn't his visibility, it's his position. He's only dangerous if he can establish and maintain a position where he has time and space to make a calculated shot. You take that position away from him, you force him to move or reveal himself, and you've neutralized his primary advantage." The major had nodded slowly, making notes in his leather-bound notebook. "The Germans will adjust," he had said. "They'll figure out what you're doing and develop countermeasures." "Almost certainly," Caldwell had agreed. "But we've bought time with this method. We've reduced casualties by a measurable percentage, and we've established that sometimes the most direct solution is effective precisely because it's unexpected." What neither man had articulated was the deeper realization that had come to Caldwell through months of this particular form of combat. Victory in modern warfare was not typically about achieving the impossible, but about maintaining small advantages long enough to compound them into meaningful outcomes. a tactic that reduced sniper reaction time by several hours if employed consistently across an entire division, translated into dozens of lives saved, dozens of soldiers who would return home to families who were expecting them. That multiplication of small advantages was what transformed individual tactical innovations into strategic significance. The Major had eventually concluded the interview with a formal recommendation that the tactic be incorporated into divisional training for future operations. It was never formally implemented with such grand scope, but the knowledge diffused through the service in that informal, almost folkloric manner through which soldiers communicate. By 1945, counter-sniper units throughout the European theatre had incorporated elements of the flash provocation tactic into their operational procedures. Caldwell himself continued in his role as scout and informal advisor until the end of the war in Europe. He participated in operations through France, Belgium, and eventually into Germany proper, though by that point, the sniper threat had been largely superseded by other tactical concerns, as frontline warfare became increasingly mobile and less conducive to the static sniper positions that had characterized the Bocage campaign. He was not wounded in action. He returned to the United States in 1945 with his rank unchanged and a modest collection of commendations that indicated above-average performance but did not capture the specific nature of his tactical innovations. After the war, Caldwell worked in construction, building houses in California. He lived a quiet life, largely unremarkable to his neighbors and friends. He did not speak frequently about his wartime service, though colleagues would occasionally notice his ability to observe details others missed, to understand spaces and angles and sightlines in ways that seemed almost intuitive. He married, raised 2 children, and died in 1987 at the age of 63, his death noted in a local newspaper obituary that made no mention of his military service or the particular form of ingenuity he had demonstrated in the darkness of a Norman night. Yet what he had discovered, a tactical principle that united physics, psychology, and the particular demands of combat, endured beyond him. The flashlight technique, refined and systematized, became incorporated into military doctrine not as something officially codified, but as part of the practical knowledge that experienced soldiers taught to those less experienced. It appeared in training manuals and field guides. It was rediscovered independently by soldiers in subsequent conflicts who faced similar tactical problems. And most significantly, it represented a particular form of problem-solving that military science had often undervalued, the kind of innovation that emerges not from laboratory testing or theoretical analysis, but from the specific pressure of a man confronting an immediate, deadly problem and forcing himself to think laterally. The moral dimension of Caldwell's innovation is worth contemplating. The tactic itself was not a violation of any recognized convention of warfare, nor did it involve weapons or methods that were prohibited. It was simply a more effective way of detecting and neutralizing a threat. And yet, the question remains, what obligations do combatants have toward one another, and does a tactic that deliberately provokes a response, relying as it does on involuntary human reaction rather than conscious calculation, cross some implicit boundary of acceptable practice? The answer, necessarily, is complicated. Warfare is fundamentally an activity designed to violate the sanctity of human life, and all methods employed within warfare exist along a spectrum of acceptability rather than at a clear boundary between acceptable and unacceptable. Caldwell's flash provocation tactic involved no deception beyond the normal deception inherent in military operations. It violated no explicit rule of engagement. It resulted in enemy soldiers being killed or wounded, but so do all successful military operations. The fact that it accomplished this goal more efficiently, more rapidly, with fewer Allied casualties, does not fundamentally alter the nature of warfare itself. What it does illustrate, however, is the particular challenge of modern combat. The pressure to innovate under extreme circumstances, the way that necessity drives both individuals and institutions towards solutions that might not emerge under conditions of comfort or ample resource. Caldwell had not invented his tactic because he was a genius. He had invented it because 3 men in his company had been killed by an enemy he could not effectively counter using conventional methods. The desperation of that situation had forced him to think differently, to question assumptions, to examine the tactical problem from angles that conventionality might never have suggested. That desperation, and the particular form of ingenuity it produced, is what connects Caldwell's experience to the broader experience of soldiers throughout history. Combat is fundamentally a crucible in which human ingenuity is tested against the brute realities of physical force, terrain, weather, and the equally compelling physical and psychological characteristics of the human being operating under extreme stress. Within that crucible, extraordinary things sometimes occur, not magical things, not impossible things, but things that seem surprising to those who have not experienced comparable pressure. The story of Caldwell's flashlight tactic is ultimately the story of one man's response to a specific tactical problem. But it is also emblematic of a broader reality about military innovation. The most significant breakthroughs often emerge not from the highest ranks or the most sophisticated planning processes, but from ordinary soldiers in contact with the enemy, people who possess both the necessity to innovate and the freedom to do so without excessive oversight or bureaucratic constraint. In the decades following the war, military organizations would attempt to systematize this kind of innovation, to create structures and processes that would reliably generate tactical and operational breakthroughs. They met with mixed success. The irony is that the more systematically an organization attempts to cultivate innovation, the more difficult true innovation becomes, because the very structure designed to encourage new thinking tends simultaneously to constrain it within acceptable parameters. Caldwell, in the darkness of the Norman Bocage, had possessed neither structure nor constraints. He had possessed only a problem, some intellectual resources, and a willingness to test his ideas under genuinely dangerous conditions. The result was a tactic that worked, that saved lives, and that remained effective long enough to influence the broader practice of warfare. This was not the triumph of genius working in idealized conditions. It was the triumph of pragmatism under pressure, of a man asking not, what is the theoretically perfect solution, but rather, what is a solution that might work with the resources I have available and the time I have available? If this story resonates with you, if you find yourself interested in the particular way that human ingenuity confronts the challenges of military operations, in the way that seemingly foolish ideas sometimes prove effective, in the way that individual soldiers innovate and adapt in response to pressure, then please join us for more stories like this. Subscribe to this channel for weekly explorations of lesser-known history, of the individuals who shaped events through unexpected breakthroughs and unconventional thinking. These stories deserve to be remembered and studied, not as entertainment, but as illustrations of human capability under extreme conditions. Click that subscribe button now and be part of a community of people interested in understanding the real history behind the headlines.